All right, Jameson, welcome to the Man Talk Show. How you doing today, buddy?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Connor.
Yeah, man. How do you describe your work to people? Because uh, I love the fact that you're diving into these sort of ancient stories and then unpacking them, and it seems like they're kind of a mirror for people to look at themselves in their own life. But how do you describe your work to people?
So the simplest way is just to say I just basically retell the greatest stories ever told with a focus on the choices that the characters make because I want us to be able to pay attention to how their choices impact the results that we see at the end of the book, whether it's their success or their demise. I also have found some of the value I didn't anticipate when I started was just the fact that I kind of am translating the story into a medium that is way more, consumable in the 21st century. Most people don't want to read a 24-hour audiobook of Moby Dick, and I give it to you in under 2 hours. And so, or if it's bringing Shakespeare into plain English that you can understand, I get really hyped about people getting in touch with stories that they felt were kind of out of touch
Mm.
or out of reach for whatever reason.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's interesting because these stories, like I remember in my 20s reading through the Iliad and the Odyssey and Moby Dick, and just because of my degree, I ended up going into like Shakespeare and reading different poetry and stuff like that. And I don't know if it's just the lens that I've always looked through, but it was it was almost like anytime I was reading those stories, it was a process of self-reflection of trying to think about, well, what would I do in that situation, and how would I show up, and how would I make those decisions, and what if that had happened to me, or trying to conceptualize that character as a person that I knew in my life, and then trying to look at, like, why would somebody make that decision? And I've always been fascinated. I mean, obviously, based on the work that I do, I've always been fascinated about why people do the things they do, because I grew up in a family system with such paradox, and juxtaposition of characters. Like there's two different family systems and the characters were wildly different. And it was always like, why the hell did she do that? But she did that, or he did that. And he, like, what is happening? And so that's just always been a part of my frame of how I've read these stories. But I've realized over time that that's not always the case for a lot of people. So what I wanted to focus in on today was going maybe a little bit deeper into the stories of the stories, the labors, the challenges, and trials of Hercules, um, because he's kind of got the hallmarks of what I think a lot of modern men are dealing with. So maybe just set the stage for us. Everybody kind of knows, Hercules, strong guy, the lion head and lion mane and stuff like that. But set the stage of what are some of the important attributes of Hercules' life that modern men might need to know about that sometimes get missed within the story.
Yeah, honestly, I want to kind of start that by going all the way back to one of the other famous stories about Hercules called The Choice of Hercules, or sometimes it's Hercules at the Crossroads, when he's met at a crossroads by Arete, the goddess of virtue, and then I can't remember the Greek name for the goddess of vice, and they're both kind of tempting him down their path. And the goddess of vice is basically saying, like, you'll never have to work and life will just be amazing, it'll feel great, and I can promise you the cushiest existence ever, basically, and people will just love you. And Arete is just speaking straight and says, like, this path is not easy. I'm not promising anything other than like the rewards for your own labor, and that even though the other side is flashier, this is the path you have to take if you want to be accepted by the gods,
Hmm.
essentially. And so he makes that choice at a young age. And if we're thinking in terms of the Disney movie, I like to imagine that that crossroads scene happens right before he starts singing "I Can Go the Distance." But um, at the point of the story of the labors of Hercules, he's a grown man. He's got a wife and kids. He is basically in service of his cousin, who is the king, and there's kind of this subplot where he Hercules was born because Zeus was trying to get him into this position as the king of oh shoot, now I'm forgetting which kingdom, Mycenae, I think. Um, but when Hera found out, she kind of pulled some fast ones to make sure Hercules didn't get the kingship, and so Hercules ended up being a subject to his cousin. But he was just kind of doing his thing. He was out there fighting against enemies, trying to raise his three sons, and then I don't know if you want me to dive into like what the inciting event is yet, or just kind of leave it at that for
Not yet,
now.
not yet. Leave him
Okay.
hanging.
But yeah,
Leave him
so
hanging.
he's a hero. Like people adore him, and he does incredible things. But you know, being a hero is kind of like his job. And then he comes home to his family at this point in the story.
Yeah, I think one of the I want to go to his origin for a moment because that's I
Yeah.
always, go there. One of the things, well, first off, let me just touch on what you said about that choice point between uh Arete and the vice, because I think that is so applicable for modern men, and
Mhm.
it's except today it's like modernity where you can go down the path of modernity and it's all about flash and comfort and ease and like how easy can your life be and how much money can you have and how many Rolexes and Bugattis do you have and all that kind of stuff, or do you go down this path of responsibility? And I almost feel like the modern man has been disincentivized from choosing the latter, from choosing
Mhm.
arete. I think our culture and our society has shifted so greatly that men are not, I don't want to say the word rewarded, but men are not actually valued in large part for choosing that path of arete. And because it is challenging and it is hard. And I'm curious about, if you have anything that you want to weigh in on that front before I kind of go into his early part. But it does seem like it's a big challenge that a lot of men face.
I definitely agree. I would almost describe it as it feels like men are born in this day and age onto the path of the goddess of vice already. It's you're not like
Uh-huh.
at the crossroads. It's like you're already on that path and you're looking across the way and Arate is like, "Hey, you should come over here." And you're just like, "But I'm already here." Like this feels a lot easier. Like this feels more natural
Huh.
because yeah, we're very incentivized to chase clout. We're very incentivized to chase a cushy life. Like that's what status is today. Whereas at different times in different societies, status was more about like what are the hard things you've been able to achieve with the gifts and skills that you have.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I think we are kind of playing behind the eight ball in the 21st century.
Yeah, and I mean the vices that we have now. I mean, you can watch porn in your pocket. It's like
Yeah.
this freaking device that we carry around in our pocket is basically just this access point to so many vices. You can buy weed from there, just drugs, you can watch porn, you can gamble on it. I mean, you literally have access to vices 24/7 in your pocket, which is so I love that frame because it's almost like you as a man or men in today's culture and society are having to make a conscious choice to actually get off that path that we've already been put on, from the get-go. So that's a
Yeah.
very interesting frame. I like that. The
Yeah,
one thing,
oh,
go
sorry. I
ahead.
was just gonna say in that I talk about a lot on my show of the world is basically designed to turn you into an NPC, which for
Uh-huh.
anyone, I feel like most of your listeners probably are familiar with the term, but just a non-player character. It's someone who doesn't really have any motivation, no goals. It's kind of pushing you in that direction, so you have to actively fight against it.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that all the time in a lot of people that I know who have it's almost like there's this virtuous opt out of life. It's like everything's so bad. And so I'm just going to virtuously opt out of, participating in the world in any way, shape, or form, like any sort of like meaningful way. And that's a very interesting, and then that's like a badge of honor. But anyway, I I want to get into the the sort of beginning of Hercules because I think what's interesting about him is he's sort of I think he's the archetype of what a lot of young men face, which is, he's from a father who isn't really around, and his mother is disliked because of his birth, his inception, and his quote unquote stepmother, right, Hera, is absolutely hates him and
Yeah.
does not like him. And there's so many representations that I think we could extrapolate from that really go in. Not that, a lot of guys are growing up with a stepmom that hates him, but just that there's sort of the stepmother of culture and society that I think that a lot of men feel uh, doesn't really respect them or like them or sort of out to get them and that type of stuff. So can you just go into like Hercules' birth, how that sort of came about, and then we can, sort of draw from there.
Yeah. So, I mean, my mind's just racing on how you set that up because I hadn't thought of that before, but it's very interesting. So I mentioned how Zeus, I mean, Zeus was like Odin or any of the kind of top king gods in mythology. He kind of did whatever he wanted, which included philandering quite a bit. Like he just would hook up with anyone that he felt like hooking up with. Um, and
I think the
so,
modern term is called fuckboy. He was a little bit
yeah.
of a he's a little bit of a fuckboy.
Yeah. And so he has a relationship with this one particular woman, but the reason he does with her is because she is the granddaughter of Perseus. And there was a prophecy that the first great grandson of Perseus would become the king of Mycenae. Again, I'm pretty sure that was the kingdom, but it was kind of like the best kingdom to be the king of. And so he was incentivized, like I got to try to get my son in here so I can rule the heavens and my son can rule Greece. Like it's the perfect 1-2 punch. And so she becomes pregnant. Hera finds out. Hera is just fed up with having to deal with all this crap from Zeus. And she actually employs the assistance of the goddess of like childbearing to basically make Hercules' mom's labor take forever, and then she speeds up the labor of this cousin of his mom so that her son comes first, which sets up what I described earlier of him having to basically be a servant to his cousin. But that was just the beginning of Hera just hating Hercules, and the cruel irony is that Hercules, which his Greek name is Heracles, means the joy of Hera. Zeus named him that as like this boneheaded attempt to pacify his wife. At least that's how I interpret it. But yeah, his name means the joy of Hera, and yet Hera is kind of his arch nemesis through most of his life. And his existence is basically just this living, breathing reminder that she has been cheated on, and it's like this display of how unimportant she is to Zeus in her
Right.
mind.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing because it has some of the hallmarks of what a lot of kids in today's world will have grown up in, right? It's like they don't live with their dad, they live with their mom and a stepdad, right? Because Hercules' mother ends up being with somebody that essentially raises him. If I'm
Yeah.
not mistaken, I can't remember
Which,
what his
unlike the
name is.
movie, it is a king and a queen. It's not like
Yes.
humble farmers.
Yeah.
So they are pretty important. But it's Thebes, not the big Mycenae kingdom that Zeus had hoped to have him be the king of.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think it's interesting because it's one of those dynamics that I think a lot of young men grow up under, which is like their father is removed, and in their mind their father, like a lot of the men that I've worked with over the years, when there's a divorce and a separation and that boy lives with his mom, there's almost always this kind of idolization of the father that they can't be around,
Hmm.
and that they don't have access to. And it's just very interesting to see how his story unfolds. So let's kind of go into the labors and talk about some of those pieces. So maybe go to the choice point now, and we'll go from there.
Okay, so kind of continue on. I said he's married to Megara. He's got 3 sons. Life's pretty good. He's out there. I compare him. when I told this story, I compare him to General Patton because he feels most alive when he's at war. And so he's kind of finding ways to be involved in all sorts of military engagements. And he actually was out fighting against the Minion like kingdom, which it's not Minion like the little yellow guys. It's Minians. But he came home one night. I don't know if they call it a furlough back then, but he basically came home from the battlefield temporarily to see his family. And he starts feeling dizzy. And then he sees these minion soldiers attacking his home. And he goes into defense mode and he kills all of these soldiers and thinks that they're under attack. And then he comes out of it and realizes that he actually had been under a spell and the people he'd killed were actually his own family. It is a tragic story. Like the story of Hercules is so much sadder than the happy Disney movie. But he comes out and he's beside himself and he's just like, what? Like he contemplates suicide. He is just thinking, what am I doing? Like, how could this have happened? And it turns out it was Hera, who was so mad and so jealous of him that she put this curse on him so that he perceived his own family as these enemy soldiers. And so his stepfather, I guess, is trying to console him. Hercules just is like, he wants to kind of punish himself. He feels like that's the only right thing to do, is to, whether it's taking his own life or anything that would cause him the most suffering possible, because he doesn't deserve anything better than that. And but he finally is convinced to go see the Oracle of Delphi, which is this priestess who works under the god Apollo to basically give prophecies and make predictions. And he goes to her asking for a path to forgiveness. Like, is there a way I can redeem myself? What can I do? I've committed such a horrible crime. And the sentencing, if you want to call it that, comes back that he has to go serve his cousin and perform 10 labors for him. And from the different sources that I read, it kind of feels like, Hercules and the king, they get along fine, but it's not like they're really buddies, because everyone knew that Hercules was supposed to be the king, but he didn't get the throne. And so he goes to the kingdom and he reports to Eurystheus, his cousin. And the thing about Greek myths is we have so many different sources that either highlight certain things or not. And so for my narrative purposes, I'm like pulling all my favorite bits. So my favorite interpretation says that Eurystheus was like in league with Hera at this point, and they were plotting together, how do we either kill Hercules or at least humiliate him beyond recovery through these labors?
Yeah, it seems like Eurystheus, I can't say his name. How do you say it?
Eurystheus. At least I'm pretty sure that's it.
Eurystheus. And it is Mycenae, I think is how you say it. You were right. But yeah, it seems like he's almost got a grudge against him, and he's definitely trying to get him killed. But I think I'm just going to put a pin in this one part. Obviously in Greek mythology, one of the things that's interesting in a lot of these myths, the acts that happen are oftentimes so dramatic, right? He falls under this kind of spell and kills his entire family. That's not super relatable for the majority of people in today's world. But I do think that for a lot of men, there is this kind of inflection point in every man's life where he enacts a betrayal of people around him, whether it's through an infidelity, a lie, a terrible decision, acting a certain way in a relationship or a marriage. And that betrayal can send him on a kind of journey or arc, much like Hercules endures, right? Where there's a kind of salvational atonement note that's embedded into it. And I point that out because I think that a lot of the men that come into our ecosystem and in my work, they are oftentimes on the other side of that. There's been some type of betrayal or hardship that they've endured that they're trying to reconcile with, whether it's, they experienced some trauma in childhood or they've made some decisions in their life that that are not great, that have had some pain onto other people, or they're really struggling with something and stuck. And so it's interesting because I think that inflection point in Hercules' journey and story is like this calling to a grander, broader version of himself in some ways, or a deepening into who he is, but also this like incredible story of atonement. So okay, where do the journeys, where do the labors begin? So he's sort of tasked with, he doesn't know, he does know, right? He does know that he has to perform 10 labors.
Well, yeah. So he's told 10 at the beginning, and we'll see what happens to that number. I just want to add one thing to what you said, because I definitely agree that feeling of having betrayed. I think another path that can lead anyone, but men in particularly, to a very similar kind of rock bottom is just kind of having a wake up moment where you realize that the culmination of all your choices has led you to a place that you would never have believed you would fall to. Because yeah, I agree. Like when I did this episode, I was like, hopefully none of y'all are going to kill your families. Like it's not that the act itself is relatable, but just the idea of you being at the lowest point of your entire life and knowing that it's your own fault that you're there.
Yeah.
Like that is relatable. And that is something that a lot of people feel.
Yeah, and sometimes the gods in these stories play like an archetypal role, or a symbolic role. Especially like I'm a huge proponent of Jung and Jungian psychology, and for him, when he looks at a lot of these myths and stories, the gods play these sort of archetypal roles of the psyche, and so Hera being this sort of like shadow of the feminine, the shadow of the anima in the psyche that can scorn you and that can, push you into making decisions and choices and actions that you desperately regret afterwards, and you have to try and reconcile with. And I think that is very applicable for a lot of men, as you're saying. So yeah, I appreciate that. So the labors,
Yeah.
where
So the labors,
where should we begin?
I mean, we can start with the first one if we want.
Sure.
So the way I interpreted the different tellings were basically Hera and Eurystheus just decide, if we can just kill him on the first one, that would be best case scenario. If we don't even have to deal with getting through all of these different labors. And so they task him with killing the Nemean Lion, which is this just monstrous beast that has been known to, sorry, my headphones keep dripping out of my ears. This beast that had been killing locals, and just no one could find a way to kill it. There were rumors that, all these kind of mythical properties to it, but no one had survived to really know. And so in my head, I envision Hercules just not even fighting it, because he's like, if I die, great, I deserve it. And if I win, then I'm closer to redemption, right? And so he heads out, and he goes to the lion's area and discovers that, sure enough, it is impenetrable. No arrow, no sword, nothing can get through its hide. And so he basically has to choke it out. Eventually, he fights with it, and it's got razor sharp claws, all these things, and he's just totally cut up. But at some point, the lion must have gone like, holy cow, like this guy, normally they're dead or they're running away at this point, but he's still here fighting. But yeah, so he ends up having to choke it out, essentially. And even then, because he was tasked to bring back the hide. It wasn't just kill it. It's, you got to bring its skin back to me. And so he's there. It's unconscious or dead, but either way, he can't figure out how to get the hide off, because even with it unconscious, he can't get his sword in anywhere. Until Athena kind of like pops in. And, all of these gods that we think of in Greek mythology are technically like half siblings to Hercules, because most of them are children of Zeus as well. And so Athena kind of pops in and just whispers like, hey, try using its own claw. And so he grabs its paw, and it's just like a scalpel. It cuts right through. And so he's able to skin the lion. He wears the hide, including the head of the lion, over his own. And it's a funny story that when he returns to the kingdom, Eurystheus panics, thinking the lion has come, and he hides in a giant wine jar, which is kind of this repeating theme throughout the labors that they use to make fun of Eurystheus, that he's such a coward, he hides in this giant bronze jar. And you can even find in pottery and other art depictions of the labors, you'll see, there's one where he brings back a boar, and you'll see Hercules carrying the boar, and then it's Eurystheus peeking out from this bronze jar. So they really kind of try to make this contrast between the brave Hercules and the cowardly Eurystheus. But yeah, and so he ends up bringing back the hide, and just kind of saying, all right, what's next?
Yeah, I love the first challenge because the first labor, because it really is a kind of confrontation with the invulnerable. Like the lion is supposed to be this have impenetrable skin, right, and be completely invulnerable, and then he has to overpower it with sort of like raw strength and power. And I think it's so, again, as you lay out the labors, I think what I'm gonna do is try and weave it back into our experience as men, and I'd love to hear your take on all of it. But I think for every man, there's a moment where he sort of faces a challenge that feels impossible. That feels impossible to sort of penetrate or pierce through or deal with, whether it's addiction or the loss of a relationship or the grief that he's carrying or the shame that he's carrying, or some type of external trial, right, financially. And I think sometimes we want to move to tools and tricks and these things that can that most of the time will pierce through these challenges, but there are moments in life where it sort of demands that you fall back on a kind of like raw courage and presence, that sort of calls you to wrestle with something directly that actually terrifies you and that has the capacity to incapacitate you. And I think that's in the sort of like hero's journey, that's the call to the underworld. That's the descent, right? Is that you're entering into the unknown, and the unknown is always much broader and much greater than you. And in alchemy, that's the negredo, right? Like you're descending down into the negredo. And so I think Hercules has gone through the descent in some ways through losing his family, and he's having to, now he's sort of like in the underworld in some ways. I think he even goes into the underworld at one point.
Yeah, we end up there.
So, but I love that, because I love this beginning, because it really sets the standard of, he is the symbol and the archetype of a man wrestling with his own strength and power. And what does it mean to be a man who has strength and power? And he's experienced both, right? It's like it's gotten him accolades, but his strength and power has also decimated his family. And this is almost like a redemption labor. So any thoughts on that? I know I laid a little bit out there, but any thoughts on?
No, but I love this format. I love getting your take from the work you do on each of the labors. To me, the Nemean Lion, and I mean almost any of the labors, but specifically the Nemean Lion, it does speak to something that I see as a common theme, both in terms of the characters we consider very heroic, as well as the things that's missing in a lot of people's lives these days is just this idea of, it doesn't matter if the odds aren't good. What else are you going to do? Like, what is the alternative? Just curl up and let life happen to you instead of giving it your best shot, at least. And that the ones we consider heroes, I just covered Lord of the Rings on the show recently. It was the biggest undertaking I've ever done, and probably the thing I'm the most proud of ever having made. And the speech that Sam gives to Frodo as they're going into Mordor, it's a little different from the movie, but it's just as good. And he brings up this point of, I used to think that the characters in the books and the stories we loved, they wanted that life, and that they were adventurous by nature. But now I realize it's just the things that happen to normal people. But the reason that we know those stories is because they're the ones who didn't give up. And that there are plenty of other stories where they did give up and we don't talk about them. Yeah. And so just that idea of like, it doesn't matter if the odds are insurmountable, because what other option do you have? Just to fade into obscurity? So you might as well try.
I love that. Okay. I have so many other things that I'd want to say on that, but I think for the effort of wanting to continue on and for the listeners' experience, let's talk about the Hydra, because I think the Hydra comes next, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, the Hydra
unpack that a little bit.
Of Lerna, I believe. I should pull up my notes so I can remember some of the details. of these places. But the Hydra, it's the same Hydra you're thinking of. It technically, most of the sources I read said it started with 9 heads instead of 3. But yeah, the idea you cut off a head, 2 more grow back. And Hercules, who actually very much favored a club instead of a sword. Most of the depictions, he looks like he's carrying a big turkey drumstick around. And but he's described as being able to use so much force that with a club with no sharp edge, he can still just tear a head off of the Hydra with the blunt force. But then 2 grow back, and he's trying to figure out what to do. There's like this funny subplot where Hera pops in and out of some of these labors, like trying to foil him even more than just the labor itself. So there's a subplot where she sends in this giant crab to try to interfere, but as soon as the crab pinches him, he just like, the crab's just done for. And Hera's so sad that she actually turns it into the Cancer constellation. I love like those origin stories. You're like, oh, okay, so that's where we get that from, right? But it isn't until his nephew, who I can't remember, Iolus, I think is his name. I can't remember. His nephew has the idea of like, what if we cauterize each neck when we tear it off? So Hercules blocks the head off, and then Iolus uses a torch to like sear the flesh. And that does actually stop them from growing back. And so they get to work, kind of dancing around as the Hydra's trying to get at them. And they cut off all the heads and burn all of the open wounds until they get to this one last head that's immortal. So even when they cut it off, it's not dead. But they still cauterize its neck, and then they bury it under a giant rock. So nothing ever like bring it back up. But when Hercules, what's interesting with this one is when Hercules gets back victorious, Theseus or Eurystheus finds this moment in his like despair of seeing his cousin succeed at these like impossible labors. He has this moment of like, aha, I gotcha, where he says, oh, well, that one doesn't count. You can't use any help. Like you weren't allowed to have someone help you achieve this. So you're going to have to do another labor to make up for this one because it didn't count.
Nothing like completing a mission and then coming back and being like that wasn't good enough, or like you didn't follow the rules according to plan. I think this is probably one of the most well-known labors. I think the lion and then the Hydra are very, very well known, and I'm glad that we're getting into them. And I think for men, when I read this one, because I was telling you beforehand, I recently visited all of the entire Hercules stories and, read through all of them through some of Stephen Fry's work, because he's done a whole bunch of different, writings on myth and sort of retelling the stories. And it's very interesting. But one of the things that I find that stands out is just this sort of like chronic repetition of our cycles and our patterns, and that there's these reoccurring destructive patterns. And it feels like I've heard people, did you ever play whack-a-mole as a kid? You'd like hit a mole at like that big game, and then, 2 more would pop up. And I think for a lot of people, that's how it feels when they start down the path of therapeutic work or personal development work, is that you start to address one issue and it feels like you're just about to get it under control. And then it's almost like you have 2 more pop out. And so it's this notion that we have these reoccurring destructive patterns, and those things don't go away unless we sort of deal with the root, unless we sort of deal with, here he cauterized, they cauterize the severed heads, and you're not necessarily doing that with like your childhood trauma, but it does speak to getting to the root of something in order to be able to sort of deal with the real challenge that is in front of you. And unless you do that, there's no amount of, just I'm going to cold turkey it and wish for the best. You really have to get down to the sort of like the root of the issues, whether it's your anger, your porn, your drinking, your procrastination. Oftentimes these things, they have a much deeper root. And we want to try and address these habits usually in a very superficial way. And I think that true change comes from us really dealing with the root of the issue, and stopping the bleeding from that place, I guess you could say. I'm curious if you want to add anything to that or where we should go next. I don't think that we need to go through the labors,
Yeah, I was gonna say I can probably
chronologically.
summarize the next few pretty briefly because they're not as. But the one thing I want to add, because yeah, I think that's a great takeaway of just the idea of we can't fix our problems without solving the root problem, right? But to me, I also really did hone in on that moment of the dejection of Eurystheus telling him like, "Oh, that doesn't count." And how do you respond in that moment? Like, do you just say, "Oh, the rules are always changing, the goalposts are always moving, this isn't fair, like I don't want to play this game," or do you just kind of buckle down and say, "I'm going to do this no matter what it takes. And
Mm,
if I have to learn these sneaky rules in order to do it, like I'll do it. It doesn't matter." And to Hercules has this extra layer of just he kind of feels like no matter what, he deserves it. Like he still just thinks he's the lowest piece of trash because he
yeah.
killed his family. And so to some extent, he's just like, fine, like the more suffering, the better, I guess you could say. And so he just accepts it because finishing the mission matters more than if he feels it's a fair mission.
Interesting. I think that's a very interesting lesson because I do think that I mean I think back to my own life when the decisions and choices and behaviors that I had deployed in my life completely cratered uh, relationship, career, et cetera. And on the other side of that, trying to sort of get my life back together, it certainly took a while where I was facing trials and obstacles and challenges that the shame was still crippling, you
Yeah.
know? And it was like, oh, I deserve this still. And so it's interesting to hear you say that because it's like, even in this point of the story, or at this point of the story, Hercules hasn't, it's not like he's enacting resiliency, he's really just like, no, I deserve this form of punishment. And I think that's so applicable. I see men all the time after maybe they, implode a marriage or they make some bad decisions or whatever it is. There is a period of time where I think we go through digging ourselves out of the hole in whatever way that looks like, not because we are resilient, but actually because there it is just like this is kind of what I deserve in a way. And so I have to face these labors. I have to face these challenges. I have to tell the truth or, go to rehab or whatever it is, because that's what's necessary for me to endure or experience. And I don't know, there's something in there that feels interesting because I think sometimes therapy and personal development work can be sort of touted as this uh like raw mentality that
Mhm.
like you're always resilient through the entire process and you're always lots of courage and bravery. It's like, no, sometimes it's just you were a piece of shit and you think that this is what you have to do because you were acting like a piece of shit. Does that maybe that's too blunt, but
Well, I mean, I agree with the sentiment of like who's to say how bad we should feel, like how often do we beat ourselves up more than we should? I do think any decent level of self-awareness will involve some level of self-chastisement as well, but we're our own harshest critics, and do
mm,
we almost relish in seeking suffering because it makes us feel like we're redeeming ourselves in that way, I guess. But
mm,
it's a complicated question.
yeah. Well, maybe that's one above our pay grade. So let's
Yeah.
let's continue
Yeah.
on.
So I
Where
can
where do we want to go
summarize
next?
a handful of the next ones really
Sure.
fast, just so we kind of know the process, but there's not a ton that we need to talk about. So he's ordered to go. They're kind of like, okay, he's too good at killing these impossible to kill creatures. Let's try something different. They order him to go capture the Cyrenian hind. Anyway, it's basically the goddess of the hunt, Artemis's pet, and it's supposed to be uncatchable. It's the fastest creature, and um, some versions say that he just ran it down for an entire year until it finally tired. Others say that he did land an arrow on one of its legs, and so Artemis shows up and is like, "What are you doing, man? Like, what's you're like taking my pet?" And he promises, he's like, "Hey, I'm not gonna hurt it. I just have to take it back to Eurystheus." And he gets very clever because Eurystheus actually did want to kill the animal, but Hercules just kind of like lets it go at the last second and it runs away. He's like, oh, oops, like you weren't fast enough to capture it. Then he has to track down this big giant boar. It's kind of similar to the lion. It's been killing all these people around where it lives, and he gets a tip to chase it into the mountains where there's really deep snow until it just gets stuck in the snow, and then he's able to chain it up and bring it back. And that's another one where the depictions of him bringing the boar back shows Eurystheus in the bronze char, like peeking out at him. An interesting one is the stables. He has to clean these stables of these sacred cows, and I think it's odd. I hope Alex Petkiss doesn't see this. He'll criticize my Greek. But,
Can give you a hard time.
Yeah, I deserve it. I'm not that good at Greek, but this king has these stables of these sacred cattle that have not been cleaned in 30 years. And Hercules is tasked with cleaning him, and you know they're Hera and Eurystheus were hoping to totally humiliate him. Like he's a demigod, he's this hero, and here he is a stable boy, just like cleaning the stalls of these animals. And so Hercules tries to think of a way to make it a little more interesting, and he makes a deal with the king that if he's able to clean these stables in one day, he gets a tenth of the cattle as like payment. And he gets clever, and he actually creates these dams with these rivers that wash out the stables in a single day. But this is the second time where he goes back and Eurystheus is like, you can't take payment for these. Like, what are you doing? Like, that's another one that doesn't count. So all of a sudden 10 labors have turned to 12. And Hercules kind of decides like, okay, I have to play these straight. Like I cannot be trying to be clever. I cannot be trying to like get out of the exact instructions because he has the power to just punish me if he wants to. So I have to give him no excuse to punish me. And then the next couple also, I think we can kind of talk. He has to go kill these birds that have like metal beaks that are terrorizing everything, but they're in this swamp and he can't really get line on them with his bow because they just hop from tree to tree. And then Athena pops in again and gives him this like rattle basically that sounds so horrible that the birds all scatter into the air and he's able to kill the birds. And then the next two I think are a really interesting point because it's another to me it's another lesson of, you know, when you have a big goal mission in front of you or it's going to take you a long time, you might hit a period of flow where things are going really well to the point where you almost kind of get careless. And like that's where we get here. So the setup is that the seventh labor is he has to go capture the Cretan bull, which there's a whole lot of history behind this bull in other stories in Greek mythology. But basically he shows up to Crete and the king Minos is basically like, if you can capture it, it's yours. Like, I'm not going to stop you. And this is, and a lot of these are like personal interpretations because in the actual sources, like the Library of Hippolyta, it's sentences, right? And I'm trying to create this narrative. But it talks about how he brings the bull back and Eurystheus is like, yeah, just let it go. And Hercules lets it go, and then it turns out it goes to, I think, Marathon, but it goes to a different city and starts terrorizing people in that city. So I humorously interpreted that as both of them are just kind of going through the motions at this point. It's like, okay, fine. Like, you got the labor done. Like, get that bull out of my sight. I don't want to see it. And Hercules is like, okay, fine. And they don't notice that, like, they've let this terror loose that's, like, hurting a lot of people. And so it's kind of like he's in this groove and he's making progress, but he's getting careless because he's just, you know, it's like, I'm still in the middle of it. I'm not anywhere near finishing it. But then the next labor, something happens that kind of sobers him up. And so he's tasked with going to capture these flesh-eating horses, if that's not a terrifying thought.
That sounds like a great horror movie.
Right? So these horses, or mares specifically, had been trained by their owner, King Diomedes, to basically eat the flesh of his enemies or a servant who displeased him. Like whoever he was like, yeah, just feed him to the horses. And so he first goes and captures the horses by like chasing them onto this kind of small peninsula, and then he digs a trench so they're now trapped on an island. And then he leaves a friend of his while he goes to deal with the king, who is like not happy that he's taking his horses and is trying to stop him. But when he comes back from dealing with the king, he finds that his friend has been eaten, like killed by the horses. And he kind of has this other falling out moment where or crashing out moment where he's just like, another person has died because of me. Like someone else I care about is dead because of me. And so that coming right off the back of the Cretan bull where he's like, yeah, whatever. I just felt like this is this really strong lesson of, you know, don't get careless enough when you're in the middle of it that you make a mistake that actually does give you even more regret while you're on the way to accomplishing what you're trying to accomplish.
Interesting. Interesting. Is there, I mean, that's such a valuable piece of insight, because I do think this is right in the middle of the arc, right? It was like
Yeah, this is the seventh and eighth out of 12, so we're just
yeah, so
barely
just
past
on the other
50%.
side. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's such a valuable piece because I think for so many guys, there is that sort of like I've reached halfway. And especially when you're doing something that you're like, I'm not really invested or involved in this, whatever, what's the big deal? It's also interesting because the bull is such a symbol of like, uh, like male fertility, I guess, in a way you could say just sort of, this sort of like the divine bull rampaging uncontrollably. And it's sort of like that raw, primal male drive, whether that's symbolic of sexuality or ambition or dominance that can really like be destructive without any type of discipline. And it's interesting to hear what you're saying because it's almost like Hercules' lack of discipline in that moment, then just causes the bull to go off and sort of like rampage everywhere again and cause more destruction even after he's fulfilled the labor. Um,
Yeah.
and so that part's really interesting. And I think with the mares, it's just terrifying.
Yeah.
I
It
don't
is
know.
a haunting visual.
It's like, I've been reading this fantasy series by Raymond E. Feist, and there's like 31 books in total, and I'm
Oh,
I'm
wow.
probably like 22, 23 books deep. So I'm really invested now. Uh, but it's getting into this place of a sort of exploring like the chaos of evil. And
Mm,
there's a point in one of the books that I was just reading this morning, actually, where there's this sort of like creature that has come from a different dimension, where that in that dimension, they're just inherently, it's like the antithesis of how we operate. They are just fundamentally built for chaos and cruelty and destruction, and that's just how the entire society is built and operated. And one of the characters says, they're trying to figure out what they're planning, and he sort of says like, well, we're trying to think about this in a very logical, reasonable way, and we actually need to think about this as if we were completely insane. And I think that's
hmm.
such a interesting reminder because in this, Hercules kind of comes across like a real tyrant, like a real tyrant. And I think in our I think in our modern age, it's hard to conceptualize people that are like truly inherently evil and like really do bad
Mm,
things. Uh, and I think that's kind of been sterilized in our culture, a little bit, where there's sort of like, yes, there's bad people, yes, there's evil people, but we almost sterilize it by just putting these like pathologies and labels over top of them. It's like there are this ism or that ist or like whatever it is, and it kind of creates this removal from like real inherent quality of chaos and evil that I think really does exist in the world and within a lot of people. And
yeah.
I mean, Jung talked about having to face our own darkness, and that, but I also think that there's this like having to sort of confront toxicity and
Mm.
and tyranny in a way that I think is interesting within that that specific labor. I want to go, and I'm very curious about your thoughts on the next labor, the belt of how do you say it?
Hippolyta.
Hippolyta. Thank you. I was going to say
I think
Hippolyta,
so.
like I'm Latin. Hippolyta, Hippolyta. That is much better because I find this one very interesting, and that's like the dynamic between like the masculine and the feminine. So
Yeah.
lay it on us.
So he's tasked to go and steal or well take the war belt of Hippolyta, who is the queen of the Amazons. And so if you've seen the Wonder Woman movie, like the idea of these Amazon warriors is from Greek mythology, and Hippolyta was the queen, and this belt had been given to her by Ares, the god of war. So it's like a very precious item. And Hercules is kind of like, oh my gosh, like I gotta go to this, they're on this island away from everybody else, and this is gonna be crazy. He takes all these men with him, expecting confrontation, and he gets there, and it turns out Hippolyta's a fan. She's just like, I love like the stories I've heard about you. Like you're awesome, and like this is so cool, and to have you here, and she ends up offering him the belt. She's just like, yeah, man, like take it, like if I can help you out. But the problem is Hera. This is another one where Hera got involved. She came in disguise as an Amazon and started like whispering in people's ears, like, I heard he's going to kidnap the queen. And so she riles up all the other Amazons, and this big battle breaks out between the men Hercules brought and the Amazons. And I mean, Hercules does come out victorious, but in the process, like Hippolyta is killed in that battle when she was totally willing to just give him the belt because she wanted to support him, because she kind of identified with him. She saw herself in what he was trying to do, but because Hera intervened, the queen ends up dead, and Hercules has to go home with less men than he came with.
Mm. Such a good arc of. I mean, I think we're in a time right now where there's a huge gender war, like where men and women are really at odds in a way within, I think, modern culture that is very different than ever before. And I see it all the time online. Sometimes I get it online, you're like comes at
Yeah.
me. But I do think that there's a lot of animosity and tension between the masculine and the feminine, between men and women. And this is one of those interesting pieces where it's like they were good, Hercules and her were good. And there's just this sort of whispering and misinterpretation that happens from the outside, and how he was going in from this place of like conquest, domination, gotta fight, gotta go to war. And then it's, he's met with something completely opposite to what he expected. And don't they, not that they fall in love, but don't they have like a love affair? Like, don't they sleep together, if I'm not mistaken? Or
I read several different versions. I didn't read all of them, so
okay,
there may have been some, but I didn't read ones where that it went that far. But it's totally
okay,
possible.
okay. Well, either way, it was a pretty good
Yeah,
admiration.
like they were like they really liked each other in that regard.
What would you say to about like how this pertains to a modern man's relationship to women or the feminine, whether that's within himself or the world?
Well, what's interesting to me about that when you kind of bring up like the gender war, I think it's so interesting that Hippolyta and Hercules actually got along great, but it was when someone else who did have the hatred inside was
Mm,
able to stir up the hatred in others. And so to me it's like, dating is so interesting at this point in time because people are blaming each other for being the reason dating's so hard. I had to kind of decide for myself that I'm only going to date people who don't see me as the enemy. Like
mm,
it's not worth it to me to try to prove that I'm reformed enough to someone who is assuming I'm kind of the antagonist in their life to begin with. And so, but yeah, just this idea of you may be able to find people, like, I mean, if you're a man finding women, vice versa, whatever the contrasting is, that you get along with really well. But, if they have a friend who's very toxic, or if you have a friend that's very toxic, like someone else can kind of spread that toxicity into what could be a healthy partnership, friendship, relationship, whatever. So you just got to be careful who you associate with.
mm. As I tuned into your episode on this, there was a line that you sort of highlighted that was said to Hercules, I think, at the very beginning, right before the trials. I don't know who said it to him, but now it's time for you to be Hercules and bear the
Mm.
heavy burden of this disaster. Now it's time for you to be Hercules and bear the heavy burden of disaster. What does that mean to you?
That is so that line is from his stepfather, and it comes to us from my favorite thing that I discovered making this episode was that one of the sources we have is a play by Seneca, the Stoic philosopher. I had read Seneca. Seneca was my first introduction into reading ancient philosophy. I read On the Shortness of Life, I think was the first thing I ever read. I had no idea he dabbled in fiction. And it's such a good play. I told everyone in the episode, like, go listen to this or go read this play, because to have a mind as sharp as Seneca try to create characters that are feeling very deep emotions, it was just so powerful. But yeah, that line was my favorite from the entire play, because it kind of felt, it's in this moment. The way I position it is that, the family's dead at this point. Hercules is beside himself, and his stepfather, who I'm blanking on the name now. I'm so bad. Like I dive into these stories, but as soon as I move on to the next story, I lose so many details from the one I just covered. But his stepfather, it feels kind of like he's almost begging him, like, I need you to be Hercules right now, because if you cannot be Hercules when it most matters, what hope does that give any of the rest of us? Like, this is the most important moment for you to be this superhuman demigod, because this is the moment that most people would just cave. And so if you cave now, what does that mean for the rest of us? It was such a powerful line to me, and I loved that scene between him and his stepfather so much.
What do you think it means to bear the burden of disaster?
I mean, in the context of this story, to me, it means specifically going on when you think you can't. It's easy to say, like, never give up or like don't stop, but when you specifically hone in the moment where you just feel like I cannot keep going, but to bear the burden of the disaster is saying find a way. Like, I don't care, find a way. You have to, because everything else falls apart if you don't. And I think that's another beautiful moment. The fact that Hercules needed that cheerleader, right? It's the importance of having bonds in your life with other men or with your partner, whoever it may be. Like, you could be the person that everyone looks up to as like the guy, but you still may have moments where you need someone to kind of have your back as well. And like he did in that moment.
Love that. Do you have any words for men that are in that place that seems like things are a disaster?
Um,
And it could be a story from a
well,
different character arc or a moment or, whatever.
I mean, I'm drawn to actually pull from my own experience, because I started this project a year and a half after I was coming out of what I perceive as my rock bottom. And I was in that phase. I kind of use the visual of a plane in nosedive. Like, you can stop plummeting, but there's this part of the bottom where you are grinding. There's so much force being exerted on you. You're working the hardest you've ever worked. But in terms of your elevation, like, it's almost no perceivable change, because you're pulling out of the nosedive, and then you start kind of climbing again. And so to me, reflecting back on where I was at my lowest point, I don't know. The only advice I can give is, if you feel like you're in your worst moment, if you keep going, it's going to get better. Like, it's the best thing that your current self, if you feel like you're in the worst position in your life, the greatest gift your future self can give your current self can give your future self is to not quit. And your future self will thank you for that every single day.
Love that. Love that. What role do you think atonement and responsibility sort of play in Hercules's arc?
Yeah, so I mean, it kind of makes me want to just jump to the 12th labor, if we want to go there. So there are a few more, but most of them are kind of, it's they're labors that were created to make sure there were enough. So the last labor, he's sent to actually go down to the underworld and collect Cerberus, the three-headed guard dog of Hades' kingdom. And so he goes down, and you remember, Hades is his uncle. And so he talks to Hades, and Hades basically is like, all right, I'll let you take him if you can subdue him without using any weapons. And so he's able to do it. What's crazy is, when you read about Cerberus, you realize that the general depiction we get doesn't cover how hideous he was. He has the three heads. there are a lot of creatures that their tail is actually a snake, but Cerberus actually has a bunch of other snakes just coming out of his spine. And so, imagine he's having to grapple again. He has no weapons, and there are all these snakes just like pelting him with bites. But he's able to bring up Cerberus, and Eurystheus kind of resigns in defeat. Just, okay, great, fine, you're done. Like, get out of my sight. But what was so interesting to me as I thought about that was the fact that there was no big celebration. There was no big, it's not like the Oracle showed up and said, you did it, congratulations, you are now clean. In Apollodorus specifically, it literally, like, it says he brought Cerberus up, he was like completed his labor, and then he sent Cerberus back to the underworld. And the next sentence is like, and then Hercules went on to do like XYZ. And so the lack of ceremony got me thinking about this idea of how dangerous it can be to be seeking redemption as a feeling, because there's no guarantee you're going to receive that feeling. If you're part of, I talk a lot on my show about tribes, and just how we're all working within a system of different tribes. And so there could be authority figures in whatever tribe, a priest, a boss, an HOA person in your neighborhood. There can be authority figures that can like grant you redemption of whatever sins you have against their tribe. But that isn't the same thing as internally feeling redeemed. Like it's not guaranteeing it's the same thing. And so this story, for the first time in my life, I just found myself thinking, like, why are we seeking redemption in that sense? And redemption is such a common thing in stories. The redemption arc is like one of the most common themes in stories, right? But I just found myself thinking about, there's no way you can guarantee that feeling will come, and second, that it will last forever. Like maybe you feel good for a year or two, and then you make another mistake, and you're like, oh, was I ever really redeemed in the first place? It's such a fickle thing that, like, it's not like you can possess it. Like, I have redemption. Like, look at this redemption. And so I think the healthiest thing to do when we're trying to figure out like our mental positioning with this idea of like, I need to atone for what I've done, is kind of just accepting that to some extent those mistakes will always stay with you. Like, you'll never do something that you just completely forget about it, and it never haunts you again. But what you can do is create a stack of evidence of things that are, good in contrast to the things that the mistakes you've made, and create so much evidence of that is who you really are, that when you think of the mistakes you made, you're like, oh, well, but look who I am. Like, that mistake doesn't define me. And that instead of seeking redemption, we should just seek to continue moving forward, because that's the only guarantee we can actually get, is that if we keep moving forward, we'll have opportunities to make better choices and to achieve better things than our failures of the past.
Well said. Very well said. Okay. Well, how, maybe sort of like a final piece here, how do you try and look at these stories and these myths, and how can people start to look at them in a different way for their own sort of wisdom, understanding? Like, maybe just give a little bit of insight into that, and anything else that feels pertinent around Hercules, if we want.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is my mission, right? Is to, and you kind of touched on this towards the beginning of this conversation when you said how when you read a story or watch a movie, you're thinking about it in terms of if you were in their shoes. My argument is everyone does that, but most of it is at a subconscious level. But like, think about the last time you watched a movie and you just kind of found yourself thinking like, that was stupid. Like, that is you judging the choice because it's not the choice you would have made in that situation. So you are evaluating the characters based on what you believe should happen, but that is at such a subconscious level compared to going into a story and then analyzing it almost with, okay, so I noticed how, he had this temperament and that led to him making this choice, which ultimately kind of undercut him because it soured everyone on their relationship with him. There's all sorts of different paths that we can see. On my show, I just released Jurassic Park today, and it's such an incredible story of someone who thinks that just because they can, like they're they have the permission to do it. And I'll just say, all I'll say is John Hammond in the book is very different from John Hammond in the movie.
Hmm.
It's a very different character, but I've learned so much in my studies. From Hamlet, I learned how being indecisive is actually kind of killing you. In his case, literally, but to us, it's killing our future opportunities when we just don't make a choice. I could just go on with listing all these different examples of what I've covered. But I just think it is such a wasted opportunity if we don't actually look at stories as these simulations of, this is what happens when someone who's given an opportunity wastes it, or this is what happens when someone takes this other person for granted, and we see how like it comes back to bite them. Like there are ways for us to kind of be in this matrix of understanding the consequences of actions without having to live them ourselves, so we can learn from them and become the best versions of ourselves. So the protagonists of our own life, if you put it that way.
Love that. Love that. Well, I think that is probably a great place for us to pause, but also a very good reminder for a lot of people, because these stories are very profound and sometimes hold truths that you can't just sort of like pack into a one sentence or a quote for Instagram or X or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So I do think that that's a good reminder. So for those wanting to learn more about you and becoming the main character, where can they find you?
Yeah, so the podcast at this point is the only real presence I have. You can find it, Becoming the Main Character, on any platform. I am on Instagram and X as @BecomingMain. I need to be more active on there. And I am, since I know a lot of your audience watches stuff on YouTube, I'm trying to get my episodes on YouTube. It's just a whole other editing process. So I've got my Lord of the Rings episodes up there, but I'm still figuring out how to get every release on YouTube. But yeah, you can find me there. Feel free to DM me if you have any questions or a story that you'd love to see me cover. But it's a good time. We have a lot of fun just discovering these stories and diving into all sorts of like fun facts and nuggets that give us a deeper understanding of the world that the story takes place in.
Love that. Love that. Well, thanks very much for your time, your wisdom, your work. And for everybody that's out there listening or watching, don't forget to man it forward. Share this episode with somebody that you know will enjoy it, could use to hear it. And as always, until next week, Connor Beaton signing off.